Hello and welcome to CardioTube here at CRT 2020 in Washington, D.C. I'm Toby Rogers and I have the great pleasure today of speaking with Howie Herman and Paul Sorajja. And today we're going to be talking about transcatheter mitral valve repair versus replacement. But before we talk about transcatheter, we have to go back and start with surgery. So Howie, give us a little bit of a background of how do we get here, surgery, repair versus replacement. Where do we stand on the surgical side of the playing field?
Well, I think we have to talk about that, we have to, of course, talk about the two different types of mitral regurgitation, primary and secondary. And I think in primary mitral regurgitation, it's pretty clear that surgery repair is the way to go. It works the best, we have the best outcomes, it preserves the native valve, we don't have any of the issues with prosthetic devices. That said, not all patients do well with surgery, particularly the high-risk patients. And so we moved from the Everest 2 trial, which tried to be a MitraClip for everyone trial, which it did not turn out to be as good as surgery, to MitraClip for high-risk patients, and that's how we got to MitraClip approval for primary degenerative MR. On the functional side, we now have surgery not usually being the preferred option, and so that seemed to be a ripe modality for us to try transcatheter approaches. And so we have transcatheter mitral repair with MitraClip, and we have COAPT and Mitra-FR with somewhat divergent outcomes, and now we're moving into transcatheter mitral valve replacement as another option for these patients.
And so, just focusing on the degenerative first, does that sort of surgical paradigm that the repair is best translate to transcatheter approaches as well, Paul?
Well, I think it depends on what type of degree of relief you're aiming for, but I think that in general, as terms, I would say yes, we always want to try to repair a valve rather than replace. Certainly, a replacement with a prosthesis is going to carry its own risk of complications and issues that go along with having a prosthesis that may be associated with bleeding or degeneration in the future. If we can avoid having a prosthesis by repairing a valve, and getting the same result in terms of efficacy, then I think that that's going to be our preferred method.
Well, I think that's a key point, though. Can we get the same results? I mean, with transcatheter repair, obviously we don't have the same toolbox the surgeons have to get repair results. And for us to get residual mild to moderate mitral regurgitation may not be as good as what a surgeon can get with a open repair.
I mean, it's unusual for a surgeon to do just one thing when they're in there, right? They do an annuloplasty and a leaflet reduction and maybe put a new cord in or something.
Yeah.
Is that what we're going to have to do with catheter tools as well?
Well, I do think that the toolbox and having multiple tools are going to be important, but I think regardless, if you look at the TVT registry, it is remarkable that despite having just one tool, and that being a transcatheter method, that the result of the transcatheter procedures is mild or less in about 60 to 65%. And actually in COAPT it's over 80. And so it is actually quite remarkable that you can get close to a surgical or a surgical-like result with one tool currently. But going forward, I do think because of the heterogeneity in the mitral valve, you're going to need more tools. The challenge there is that all these devices are studied and approved in a singular fashion. We don't have trials or planned trials in which one device will be randomized against a combination of devices per se, or a combination of devices will be tested against surgery per se. And so each of these devices, with their limitations, will always fall a little short without the other tools to be added.
I mean, and how practical is it to plan to do a transcatheter annuloplasty and then a clip? And
I think it's going to be a long time till we're really doing that kind of thing on a regular basis in the US between the investigational devices and the reimbursement considerations and just the time. I think it's going to be an anecdotal solution rather than a true solution. I think the subcontext of your question, though, is really, is there a role for transcatheter mitral valve replacement? Where does that fall into the realm now? If you are a zealot for the COAPT trial, you would say that COAPT has taken mitral regurgitation into one device for the future and it works in everybody and we don't really need anything else. And then you look at Mitra-FR and you say, maybe not. And I think there still is a role for transcatheter mitral valve replacement. I see that in sort of three buckets. The first is that MitraClip does not work for everybody. even in the registry, there was a lot of selection who got MitraClip. Only the patients who they wanted to treat were treated.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of patients with MAC, with rheumatic disease, with small annuluses, with commissural MR, who are just not good candidates for MitraClip. And in fact, close to 60% of patients considered for COAPT were excluded on one reason or another, not all anatomic, but were excluded. The second part of that is that there was a lot of residual MR in these patients. In Mitra FR, it was about 17% had severe MR at 1 year, and even in COAPT, almost a third of patients had 2+ or more MR at 1 year. And we know that even moderate MR in functional disease affects survival. And then you add to that the increasingly nice and good results that we're getting with transcatheter mitral valve replacement. Spearheaded by the work that you're doing with Tendyne and that device, which has shown exceptional results for MR reduction and safety.
Despite a transthoracic, transapical approach, which we'd all assume to be associated with a lot more morbidity.
Yeah.
Although the future is going to be transeptal for a lot of devices.
I think we've been actually quite surprised with some of the results, with in terms of the safety and also the relief of the MR. And I think that's what it's going to come down to. So when we have a patient, we're discussing transcatheter repair versus replacement, the discussion usually comes down to a balance between risk of residual MR versus a risk of the prosthesis. And one's going to have to take one or the other, at least for the foreseeable future.
And I mean, it's exciting that there is a clinical trial just starting up that will compare transcatheter replacement versus transcatheter repair.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the SUMMIT study, the SUMMIT IDE study, which is the Tendyne prosthesis, they are randomizing Tendyne TMVR versus MitraClip in patients who are eligible for both. And then there's a single non-randomized registry for patients who can't be clipped.
And this is patients with functional and degenerative.
Correct.
Which is interesting. So we're almost blurring the lines now. We're not using that that distinction of functional degenerative. We're just saying you've got MR, let's treat you with transcatheter tools.
Yeah. It's different from the Apollo trial, which they're still randomizing against surgery as far as
No, they've switched over. The Apollo trial with Intrepid also now is going to be allowing MitraClip arm. But again, it's going to be a little blurred because they started with replacement surgery. They're moving into MitraClip. And then there's the second issue, they're changing the device too from a transapical to a transeptal device. So I think they're going to be a little blurring there. And if there was one lesson as an older cardiologist I can tell you from Everest 2 is when you swing for the fences and you end up with a double, you can get stranded on second base. And that can be a problem. And that's what happened with Everest 2. And it took 10 years for us to get a MitraClip approval after the initiation of the Everest 2 trial because of that muddied result. So I'm hoping that isn't the case.
Yeah.
I have some experience with with a transeptal device, the Evoke device from Edwards, which we're getting very nice results with. We're showing some of those results here at the CRT meeting for the first 14 patients, showing excellent outcomes. And it's become a very much more, I hesitate to use the word MitraClip-like, but it has a steering capability that is very similar to MitraClip that allows us in multiple planes to position the device. And we're getting average device times of about 30 minutes now when we place that device transeptally.
Wow.
So just sort of a couple of quick fire questions. Going forwards, do we still have to compare everything to surgery, or can we compare transcatheter to transcatheter?
I think it depends on what you consider to be the gold standard. And right now, surgery for DMR, yes, I would say that's still considered the gold standard. For secondary MR, I think it's less clear because of the MitraClip COAPT results, and that's a difficult question right now. So.
And I know everyone always asks this question, predict the future, get out your crystal ball, repair versus replacement. The cop-out answer is, well, there'll always be a place for both approaches. Yes. But does the transcatheter perspective change your opinion of that? Does a simple transcatheter replacement trump all repairs because it's easy, quick, and in and out?
I don't see them as competitive. I see them as complementary, and I think the future actually will involve trying repair, and if it doesn't work, then considering replacement, or considering replacement right off the bat. And so I think we'll have the tools to do both. in these patients.
Howie?
I think it's going to be very complicated. I think we're always going to be balancing, as Paul suggested, safety and efficacy. So the first thing is, how safe is the procedure? And the repairs are generally very, very safe. The replacements appear safe in these early trials, but very selected patients and not all comers the way MitraClip is now being utilized. And then there's going to be the efficacy side of it. But on top of that will be not only the anatomic concerns, but also the patient concerns and the need for shared patient decision making. If you have a 90-year-old who is having shortness of breath with daily activities and you can reduce their MR and give them a quality of life, that may be more important for that patient than in a 70-year-old where you're really thinking about long-term survival and getting as low an amount of MR as possible.
That's right.
So I think it'll be a very complicated decision making, and I think AI will not replace us in this realm for a while. That we really need physicians who understand this disease and the devices to be able to make the right decision for the right patient.
And it's only going to get more complicated as more and more devices are available. So, but then that's what makes it an exciting field and such a dynamic field. Well, thank you both for your time, and really look forward to the updates that you're providing at this meeting and further data going forward. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Toby.